And so today I want to talk about tithing. Right? These experiences always disturbed me because in both occasions I was, doing this kind of luxury trip overseas that cost thousands of dollars, and I came with someone who was begging on the street to live. And when you have that kind of contrast, it does make you start to think to yourself, is this really right? Is this the way it should be? And so I want to talk about tithing because I think many people misunderstand it. And I've been thinking a bit about it lately, and I've come to the conclusion that the topic is deeper than most people realise. So to set the scene, I want to, I think it's useful to understand the two things that the Torah teaches, or the Bible teaches, about our relationship to property and land more generally. So let's have a look. Okay, so the first one is that God, in His law, both allows and protects private property rights. So the Torah allows and protects private ownership in land. Okay, and by land I don't just mean dirt. I'm talking about things in the earth, natural resources, water, animals, that sort of stuff. Now the significance of this is easy to know. We see this in obviously, the Torah allows people the right and protects the people to right own land, which is a precious resource. Now, ancient Israel differed from many of the nations around it, such as Egypt, where it was actually assumed that the king, or the pharaoh, owned the land, and his subjects merely tenanted it from him. And the Old Testament is actually quite jarring in that it doesn't have this perspective. Instead, Scripture teaches that God owns the land. It says the earth is the Lord's and all it contains. And God told the Israelites in Leviticus, the land is mine, for you are only strangers and sojourners with me. But despite this, God gave His people almost all the rights that you would associate with ownership over land, if you look at it. First, God divided Canaan into separate allotments, assigned families each lot, and told them to possess these lots. Through God's grant, they were allowed to possess and occupy a parcel of land. Second, they had the right to use and enjoy the land. They could plant their own crops, raise animals, and profit from their work. And this was what was protected in law. If your ox wandered into a neighbour's field and caused damage, you were required to make restitution. They didn't consider it that you had harmed your own field. It was illegal to move boundary markers. And repeatedly, the Torah assumed that a labourer is worthy of his hire and the fruit of his labour. There's passages like, do not muzzle an ox when he's threshing your grain, because even animals are allowed the fruit of their labour. The underlying assumption is that people were entitled to benefit from their own work. And it might interest you to know that income tax did not exist in the ancient world. It originated in 1799 when England was at war with Napoleon and they needed extra funds, so they brought in a new tax to bring extra funds. The war with Napoleon ended in 1814, and they still have income tax. Interesting, isn't it? Third, people appear to have had the right to exclude others from their property. Now, in a moment, we'll look at some laws that are exceptions to this, particularly gleaning. But these laws only make sense if people could not actually ordinarily enter your property and take what they wanted. For example, why tell people they can enter a field and take from its corners if they already had the right to enter the field and take anything? No. Why tell someone he may only take enough fruit to satisfy his immediate hunger if he was entitled to take any fruit he wanted? Why establish a sabbatical year, which means the wider community may come onto your land and use it if they could do that every year anyway? Right? These things only make sense if you couldn't normally do this. And people have the right to sell land and transfer ownership to others. Now, there is an exception to this. There's a law in Leviticus that prohibits the permanent sale of family property. And people often make a big deal out of this. It said that this law required the land be returned to the original family after 50 years. I think people make too much of a deal out of this. For starters, from a practical point of view, it's not going to make any difference to any individual's life. If I lose my house, being told that I can move back 50 years later from now isn't going to be very helpful to me. Okay. If you're at an age where you can own a house in your 20s and you move back in your 50s, okay, it's going to be really helpful in your life. So a lot of people make a deal of some things there. I don't have time to discuss the Jubilee legislation in depth, but what's important to see is that it's tied up, I believe, with God's special relationship with the nation of Israel. Because God promised Abraham that his descendants could possess the land of Canaan perpetually. And so what the Jubilee does is an intergenerational thing to ensure that the tribes of Israel are always possessing the land of Canaan. Okay? It's not something that you can kind of universalise to, my ancestors during the Irish potato famine weren't promised by God. Oh look, by the way, you can get New Zealand permanently or anything like that. Right? And people had the right to inherit land and bequeath it to others. And such ownership was treated as sacrosanct. This is really interesting. The Bible actually sees what you inherit as really, really important. Consider the story of Ahab and Naboth. Okay, Ahab asked to purchase Naboth's vineyard. This was a productive resource that the government needed. Right? Naboth refuses, explaining that he cannot give away the inheritance of his fathers and what he wants to give to his children. Ahab has to ask to buy it. He simply cannot take it. And this is actually what astounds Jezebel. She can't understand why the king can't just take the land. Right? Because it's such a weird thing. Right? And Ahab does steal it. Ultimately, he resorts to a corrupt legal scheme, accusing someone of treason in order to obtain the vineyard. Notice he can't nationalise the asset or impose an inheritance tax. The law only permits the taking of property when someone's committed a crime, so he has to bargain for a crime to get the land. Or consider Samuel's warning when Israel asked for a king. Samuel tells the people, he will take the best of your fields and your vineyards and your olive groves, and he will give them to his servants. And he will take 1/10 of your seed in your vineyards and give it to his officers and servants. Then you will cry out in that day because of the king whom you have chosen yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you. So this is put forward as oppressive behaviour that will cause you to cry out to the king. Right? We'll tax you 10%. Interesting, isn't it? And notice that these protections do not apply merely to personal possessions, but to what economists would call capital, the means of production. The commandment does not merely prohibit coveting your neighbour's house. It says, do not covet your neighbour's ox. And ox, of course, is productive capital. Right? So I think it was fair to say that under the law of God, people possessed very robust rights to private property, including private ownership of land. Of course, Israel was an agrarian economy rather than a modern industrial one, but the principle stands. And so in the 10 Commandments you have, do not steal, do not covet. These commandments presuppose that your neighbour owns things that you may not take from him, and in fact you shouldn't even desire to take from them. This is important because it means we have duties to respect other people's property, their capital, and what they earned. Right? This, however, is not the whole story. Right? Right. It's not the whole story. I want you to turn to a second thing the Torah teaches. Consider Genesis 1:26-30, very familiar passage. Let us make mankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, over the livestock, over all the earth, and over every crawling thing that crawls on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth, subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on earth. Then God said, behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the surface of the earth, and every tree which has fruit yielding seed. It shall be food for you. Now I want to emphasize verse 39. Most people interpret this passage as saying, look, we're allowed to eat meat. God permits us to eat meat or eat vegetables or whatever, right? In this case it's vegetables, it's the one in Genesis 1, right? But that's actually what the passage says. What it says is, I have given you every plant for food. This isn't, you're allowed to have it, it's saying I've given it to you, right? This is stronger than mere permission. If you want to give an idea how strong this language is, This is the same language God tells the tribes of Israel when he says, I've given you the land of Canaan. Right? It is used when God tells Abraham, Moses, or Joshua that he has given them the land. And this isn't saying to Israel, you have permission to have this, right? It's a grant, it's yours. You're allowed to go and take it. And who does God give this to? Well, the passage says Adam, which is the Hebrew word for man, right? But in this context, it's not referring to the individual Adam, it's referring to mankind. Because notice it says, let them rule, right? Male and female, right? It refers to every individual human being. Because it goes on to describe the people being addressed as those made in God's image. Who's made in God's image? Human individuals, right? Moreover, if you interpret this verse as meaning individual human beings can eat plants, then you have to interpret it as saying every individual is given the plants to eat, right? Similarly, the command fruitful and multiply is given to individual human beings, right? So the text says that God has given every human being the produce of the earth for food in the same way that God later gave the land of Canaan to the tribes of Israel. And this idea is reinforced in Genesis 9, right? God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. The fear and terror of you will be on every animal of the earth, and every bird of the sky, and everything that crawls on down, around the fish in the tree. They are handed over to you. Every thing that is alive shall be food for you. I have given everything to you as I gave the green plant. Here God says that in the same way he gave plants to human beings for food, he gives animals, birds, and so on. And notice this text presupposes the grant in Genesis 1. It says, I have given to everything to you, and the same way as I gave you the green plant. So this assumes the earlier grant was not merely given to Adam as an individual, but to human beings generally. Generations later, the idea is it still applies, right? In fact, the text explicit is given not just to Noah, but Noah and his sons and his descendants, right? Every human being. Okay. And again, notice the text doesn't just say that human beings may eat meat, it says, I've given these things to you. It is God, a grant authorizing human beings to take from the natural world what they need for their basic needs. He said, I'm giving you the Lord, you're allowed to take. So just think about how these texts fit together. These texts teach that God has given every human being the right to take from the natural world, plants and foods and animals for their to survive. Now, of course, food doesn't simply appear on the table. Plants and animals have to be gathered, hunted, cultivated, harvested, prepared and cooked. So the idea is they go out and they work and appropriate and they get themselves through work, right? Nevertheless, the basic point remains. Every individual being has a right to take from the natural world what it needs for sustenance. Okay? Right? And notice the context. In both passages, God commands humanity to be fruitful and multiply. For this command to be fulfilled, human beings have to remain alive to provide for their children, sustain for future generations. So the grant of Earth's resources is directed towards the preservation and flourishing of human life and people's children and so on and so forth, right? It would be really ridiculous if God said, I create the world, but I can't take anything. Be fruitful and multiply. Think about it, wouldn't make sense, would it? So we actually see two things taught in the Torah. First, people have a right to own land and private possession, the right protected by God's law. But second, every individual being has the right to take from the land and the earth the resources they need for basic human life. Both those things are taught. Now, once you understand that as both these things are taught, I think a lot of what you see in the Torah makes sense, right? Because if both these things are true, and you think about it, a possibility can arise, right? The amount of land in a geographical area is finite. So it's possible for all the land of an area to be occupied and fall into private ownership. Now, suppose I'm not one of those people. I do not have any land of my own. I do not own property. I have a right to take from the earth what I need to satisfy me. Where am I going to take it from? I cannot go to my own land and hunt game, raise sheep, or grow crops because I don't have any land to do that with. Where am I going to get these things? Well, the obvious answer is I'm going to have to go to someone else's land. Right? Where am I going to get shelter? Obviously, it's going to be on someone else's land, right? And so, I think this is a helpful way of thinking about this. And it really sort of struck me when I purchased a property a few years ago. Those of us who own land in rural areas will be familiar in situations where a title of land is encumbered by an easement of some sort, right? In English law, there's a distinction between ownership of land and particular rights of access and use over land. So Mel and I own this farm, Pokeno, and it used to be part of a larger kiwifruit orchard, which it was subdivided from. And then our property is a lake and a pump shed that irrigates the neighbouring farm. When we bought the property, the title contained an encumbrance, or an easement. The owner of the property of the neighbouring farm had a legal right to come onto our property and draw water to irrigate his land. Right? And that goes with the title. Everybody who buys our section has an entitlement. And this isn't a courtesy, it's a legal right. If we prevented him from exercising it, he would be able to take us to court and sue what's called a tort of nuisance to ensure access, right? And if we refused and his farm suffered economic loss, we would be liable for the restitution, right? So Mel and I occupy the land, possess it permanently, have a right to use it, enjoy it, exclude others from it generally, but we can't prevent our neighbour from accessing the water on our property to irrigate his farm. Now, I want to suggest to you that this is actually the way the Torah views property ownership, if you look at it carefully. So look at this passage in Leviticus 19. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very edges of your field, nor shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest. And you shall not put in a vineyard, nor shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. I leave them for the needy and for the stranger. I am the Lord your God. After we bought the property and I read this passage again, I thought, that's exactly what we have with our neighbour's pump shed. You know, that's very, very similar, right? Certain people here have a right to enter someone else's land and take harvest from a particular place. And notice, this is not simply voluntary charity. I read some theologians from America who were suggesting this is really about donating old clothes to an op shop. You know, but that's not what's going on here, right? People have the right to take the gleanings in the same way the neighbour has the right to come onto my property and take water for his land. Right? Notice also who may take it, the needy and the stranger. I think this isn't really realised, right? These are people who lack the economic resources necessary to provide for themselves. And a stranger, in particular, refers to a foreign-born person residing with Israel. Such people did not own land in Canaan. Remember, the land of Canaan was given to all the tribes of Israel, right? God had divided the land of Canaan up amongst the tribes of Israel. So resident foreigners did not receive those tribal inheritances. So these are the people who had no land. So if they need to eat or harvest, the only place they can eat or harvest is on someone else's. Right? Now, when this law is repeated in Deuteronomy, the beneficiaries are called the stranger, the orphan, and the widow. Now, people will often talk about how these people are vulnerable, and that is true, but they're all vulnerable because they lacked access to reliable, productive land, right? The widow and the orphan were vulnerable because inheritance normally passes down through the male line, right? The woman could inherit it, but because of this situation, they're particularly vulnerable for the brothers or the other members of the family who are male to basically step in and take the inheritance, right? Also, they often lack the labour resources necessary to work land effectively in the agrarian society. You know, if you're a woman with a child, orphan means fatherless, with a child, and there's this farm they've got to go, there's lots of physical manual labour on, obviously you've got a bit of a problem. You know, very, very difficult to do that, right? And the same relationship between private property and the right to access the fruits of the earth occurs in several other passages. Consider Deuteronomy 23. This one here. When you enter your neighbour's vineyard, you may eat grapes until you are satisfied, but you are not to put any in your basket. When you enter your neighbour's standing grain, you may not pluck the heads of the grain with your hand. I mean, you may pluck the heads of your grain with your hand, but you not use a sickle on your neighbour's grain. Now here the situation is more immediate. This is where a case where I need to satisfy my hunger right now, right? And there's none of them available. Okay? And this seems to be a situation involving travelling, travelling by foot in the ancient Near East. You're walking along, they don't have shops on the side of the road or anything like that, right? So you'll get to the middle of the day, it's in the desert, it's hot, and you don't have any food, so you can walk on someone else's property and just take a meal, right? And this, in Mark's Gospel, you see this. There's a principle about Jesus plucking grain while travelling on the Sabbath, right? And they're at home, they're away from home, they need food, so they grab some from a little area. So what this says, if I'm without food and I now have no access to any, and I need to fulfill my hunger now, I may enter another person's property and take what I need to support my immediate hunger. Right? And usually this is how jarringly shocking this is. This is like somebody walking into a supermarket and saying, I'm really starving, thank you, I'll take that food walking up there. Right? Yet taking a small amount of grain or fruit from someone's field so that you could eat and were satisfied was entirely lawful, provided you only took what was necessary to meet your immediate needs. You could not fill a basket or take a sickle. Okay? And if you think that's shocking, consider that Jesus himself actually did this. Alright? This is precisely his principle which was raised when his disciples plucked grain on the Sabbath. The Pharisees challenge him, and Jesus responds by pointing back to a very interesting incident in the life of David. Saul had believed David was intended to overthrow him and kill him, right? This wasn't true, but Saul believed it. So he consequently sought David's life. And so David fled into the hills and became a fugitive. As a result, he obviously didn't have access to, the ordinary means of sustaining himself. There was a period where his men were hungry and without food. So he went down to the tabernacle and took the consecrated bread that belonged to the priests. And Jesus commends him for this. David was hungry and in genuine need, so Jesus so he could take it. Right? Okay. And in my message, this actually used to be in canon law, this idea that if somebody was starving and there was no kind of charities around they could use or anything like that they were actually allowed to take what they needed from somebody's house. It used to be part of canon law, and it used to be part of English common law under Christian influence till fairly recently. People actually know that. And in fact, there's still a residual aspect of it too. If I saw someone drowning in a swimming pool or something and I ran and pulled them out, I wouldn't be done for trespass, right? That's still going to be, but it used to be in fact, it used to be in English law that you could glean on another person's property until about the implication is significant. Human need can create a legitimate claim to resources necessary for survival, even where these resources are normally reserved for others and on their property. So the Torah protects private property, but it doesn't do so in a way that nullifies the basic right of human beings to access what they need to live. Okay? Now, this background, I think, helps us understand tithing. So let's return to tithing. The laws I mentioned above enable those who lack land to take food, grain, and fruit and other produce from a person's property during the harvest. The law in Deuteronomy 23 addresses the immediate need when someone's travelling and away from home. There's also another one that I thought I'd just leave out because it'll take too long to go into, which is sabbatical year, which enables once in 7 years people to just get a general kind of access to what they need from land, right? Notice none of these is a long-term solution, right? Suppose, as was the case in ancient Israel, all land was owned and you possessed no substantial property of your own. Your ability to obtain the fruits of the earth that God has granted you will continually depend on you going onto someone else's land, and that's a long-term problem, and just being able to do every now and then the harvest every 7 years or when you're travelling wouldn't be very helpful. So this is where the tithe comes in. So I'm going to note 4 things about the tithe that you may or may not know. Right? Firstly, the tithe is not charity. Okay? I hear this over and over again, and it's not true. Right? To understand this, we need to appreciate how tithing was understood in the ancient Near East. In biblical times, tithe was a kind of grain tax. Okay? Tithes function is what we would call a tribute paid by a community to its king. And Old Testament scholars have long noted that the book of Deuteronomy is structured similar to what people call a vassal suzerain treaty. And this is how this works. This flash terms, it means like, works like this. A powerful king would grant land to a people, promise them protection in exchange for loyalty and obedience. So you're like the king of Assyria, and you've got like there's an area that you're often you want to conquer or whatever. You bring your army in and you say, "Tell you what, you give me your land, and we'll protect you, but you have to go under our laws." Right? And that was a kind of agreement between the people and the king. And there would be a tribute the people paid to the king as a tax in exchange for the privilege of this land and its protection. Right? Okay. So, in the book of Deuteronomy, you don't have a king, you have God playing that role, and the tribute goes to him. Right? So the tribute functions both like a tax and also like a rent, in the sense that this is the land grant the king is giving you, and you have to pay tribute on the land, right? It functioned like a rent because the king was understood to own the land on which the people lived, and it functioned like a tax because it financed the administration of the kingdom. Deuteronomy takes this familiar political structure and applies it not to the human ruler but to God. And in fact, it rejects the idea that an earthly king owns the land. God owns the land. And Israel lives upon it as, in a kind of lease from him, right? Second, the tithe is not an income tax. You probably because I already told you this, right? Income tax didn't exist in the ancient world. The tithe was taken from agricultural production. And remember, this is a barter society too, by the way, so the fact that it's, agricultural production isn't as simple as you might think it is. It consisted of grain, wine, oil, livestock, and other forms of produce generated from the land. In the sabbatical year, when fields were not cultivated, there was no reharvest, there was no tithe. A labourer who earned his wages did not tithe his wages. In fact, the Torah repeatedly insists that labourers must be paid promptly and justly and get what they work for. Right? A carpenter did not tithe. A craftsman did not tithe. Right? Tithing was tied to the harvest, the produce of the land. Right? And so, in many respects, tithing resembles what economists today call a resource rent. Okay? And in fact, the first explicit mention of a tithe occurs in Genesis, when Jacob says, "Everything that you gave me, I will give a tenth to you." Right? Notice the language. The tithe is paid from what God has given me. Right? And it was taken from what's called a person's increase, the surplus from the land. This is significant. I'll explain what's going on here. Suppose two farmers cultivate two different fields. They invest the same labour, they use the same tools and techniques, and one field generates a larger surplus than the other. Why would it do that? Not because of labour, because the labour was equal. Not because of capital, because the capital was equal. The difference lies in the productivity of the land itself, right? The raw materials, right? So this additional value, this surplus over and above your labour and everything else, okay, is not something the farmer created. Right? It's what it's God's bounty, right? See what I'm saying? It's a proportion of your surplus, which if you think about it, it's purely due to the fact that the land is good. Right? And that's your surplus. And notice God subtracts from the surplus, right? So it's like this. Imagine I provide a business owner with a highly efficient machine. In return, I ask for a share of profits attributable to that use of the machine. The payment is not a compensation for the owner's labour, it's a rent for the contribution of my resource to the success that he makes his labour. Okay. Interesting enough, I was quite stunned when I kind of realised this, because there's a lot of study in economics that the most efficient form of tax that has the least market distortion is a tax on the natural resources of land in precisely this way. Interesting, apparently that's quite widely held by economists. Interesting, isn't it? Somebody knew that dozens of years ago. And if you think about it, this makes sense. If you had a, just think about it in today's terms. If you own let's say a house in a Remuera or somewhere and you're renting it, the land in that area is going to be really high. If you are living in a really poor area, right, and that what people won't want to live there won't be desirable, so the land will be low. So the way land tax works is actually quite interesting. But it's a total side issue, but I just thought it was a fascinating thing, right? Okay. So God's relationship here is like a business owner who invests capital, right? He provided the land and the natural resources that could generate abundance, and the tithe acknowledges that no matter how hard working you are or how skilled you are, there is an aspect of this harvest that is not due to you, it's due to God, and it's from that the tithe is given. And third, so there's this kind of resource rent to God, if you like, right? The tithe is paid a particular way. When we rent a resource from God and acknowledge His contribution to our prosperity, God acknowledges that we direct the payment in a particular manner. And the tithe function as a kind of payment in lieu to those who did not receive the same access to the natural resources of the land that we did. Right? Its purpose was to ensure that their right to enjoy the fruits of the earth was not extinguished by the fact that I hold land and am making money out of it. Notice who receives the tithe. The person who receives the tithe is the Levite, the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. These are all groups who in ancient Israel lacked access to productive land. And in fact, God explicitly explains this is why the tithe was given. Why does the tribe of Levi receive support? Because he has no portion or inheritance with you, right? He doesn't give no land, right? Similarly, God says of the Levites, I have given the Levites as an inheritance all the tithe of Israel. Right? So they don't own the land, so instead, everybody who owns land for a surplus is in the tithe. And that substitutes for the fact they don't have the land, right? Okay? And notice the purpose. Why are they given it? So they may come eat and be satisfied. Right? Now the language here is important. You think, oh, that's pretty straightforward. Throughout the Torah, there is this phrase about eating and being satisfied. And it refers to freedom from want and the enjoyment of God's provision. Okay, this is the phrase that is used when God provides manna in the desert. Right now that you've got manna in the desert, you can eat and be satisfied. Right? And it is also the term that's frequently used about the land. It says, when you enter the land, you'll have this great land, and you can eat and be satisfied. You know, when you sit down and you acknowledge that God gave you this, remember, you can eat and be satisfied by it. It's commonly used for the benefits they would get from the promised land. When they enter the promised land and enjoy the fruits and cultivate it, they'll be able to eat and be satisfied. Right? So God requires here people to acknowledge His generosity in a way that ensures that their exclusive possession of a particular resource doesn't deprive other people from the blessings of God's earth. Right? And last thing is the tithe is not a voluntary charity, right? I think you see this, but it's actually true that a person could retain to choose a tithe rather than surrender it, but if they did so, they became liable for an additional payment. So this is what Leviticus says. If a man wishes to redeem part of his tithe, he shall add 1/5 to it in cash. Right? So the property owner is told he can, if he wants, retain exclusive enjoyment of his property. He can make it exclusive, and he can have everything of his surplus, right? But only if he provides compensation or a monetary substitute, right? The requirement to add 1/5 is significant because if you look, the same, paying the amount plus 1/5 is the penalty used in the Torah for cases where someone misappropriates someone else's funds, right? Where a person, through fraud or deception or breach of trust, gains someone else's property and then sort of realises it and confesses it before God and says, the normal punishment for theft won't apply. What will happen here is you just have to pay 1/5, right? and then you'll be forgiven and atoned for. So the implication here is striking. The person who withholds a tithe and then comes forward and says, look, I'm withholding a tithe, they were sort of, it's the equivalent of them saying, well, look, I've got this property and I own it under kind of dodgy circumstances, so I'll pay my restitution and then we square. And so they can retain it, but because they've compensated those upon whom the resources have been frustrated, right? So the subtext is that refusing to pay the tithe amounts to benefiting from a portion of the harvest that you are not morally entitled to keep without paying restitution. So they own the land, they've got exclusive ownership of the land, but it carried an obligation to those who would otherwise be excluded from the fruits of God's creation. So at this point you might be asking, well, what's the point of all this? We don't live in an agrarian economy, we live in an industrial one. We don't own fields or harvest crops. So what? Well, I don't think that this counts for much. First, I'll make a couple of observations. First, while we do not live in an agrarian society, I think the underlying realities are actually pretty much the same. So I do not own a field on which I sow seeds, grow food and harvest crops, but I work as a teacher in exchange for money, which I then use to drive to a local supermarket to use money to purchase that food from someone who has purchased it from someone else who's purchased it, who's grown it. Right? So I do all these things by proxy, basically. Right? I don't toil as a shepherd, but my work as a teacher is exchanged for money, which I go to buy clothing, which goes back to someone who cleans up the neighbourhood, shearing sheep or something like that. Right? So the realities are the same. It may not be as direct, but the realities are the same, right? We're actually appropriating and non-appropriating resources of the land all the time, right? My relationship to these resources is direct, but I gain access to them through intermediary steps. And there are people in our society who cannot find employment because the labour market has shut them out. Right? There are certain sectors of our economy where the demand for labour and the supply of labour just don't have. Right? Full employment is the possibility. So if you have an economy where that's happening, he's going to be put up for it. There are people who cannot pay the rent on a house, right? The amount of property that you can build houses on in New Zealand is limited, right? So there are people who shut down housing, and owning their own house, right? There are people who lack the desirable resources they need to flourish. It's also easy to forget that at the basic level, many of these issues remain fundamentally the same. So take the ownership of land, right? If you own a house in a desirable part of the room you're aware of, the value of your property gives you a significant financial advantage. At the same time as this happens, there are many people in our country who cannot afford a house or can't afford a mortgage or have to rent. Right? And so the realities are the same, right? And our access to products of farming, mining, energy extraction, water supplies actually affect our lives profoundly. Questions about who controls natural resources such as land, oil or water remains important. If you don't think that this sort of stuff about your relationship to natural resources and land counts, ask Iran if they can hold a powerful nation to ransom by cutting off a natural resource. Think about that. And what's that about your relationship to natural resources and land and what happens? So I think it's easy to think these things are this about an agrarian economy. I think actually the fundamental realities are the same. Right? Second, even though the examples in the Torah arise from an agrarian economy, the Torah is teaching principles of justice, and I think there's a clear logic being articulated here. So consider again my neighbour who has an easement allowing him to pump water from my lake. Suppose I decided that I could profit substantially from denying him access to that water, and so I cut him off. Right? I'd be liable for the harm I caused. If his crops were damaged because I excluded him from access to water, I would be responsible for that loss. Okay? So now suppose my property is subdivided into two sections, each owned by different people. And both of us just decide to deny him access because we'll make a profit out of it. No? The situation hasn't changed, right? Instead, now both owners share a partial responsibility for his loss. Right? And it doesn't change if the land is divided into 3 or 4 or 5 parcels. If all the if all the owners decide to exclude him, each will bear some responsibility for the cost that follows, right? And so I submit that something is similar in true in society where large numbers of people possess exclusive access to resources through private property that others need in order to meet their basic needs. If hundreds of people, through their legitimate God-given property rights, collectively control access to resources required for human flourishing, and each person decides they will profit from excluding the needy from these resources, then each person bears some of the responsibility for the resulting deprivation in the same way as I just made these houses, right? And this is the logic of the tithe, right? There were 12 tribes in Israel. Most received land and allotments from their subdivided, and these land and allotments were subdivided amongst clans and families. The Levites received none, right? Likewise, the foreigner, the widow, and the orphan lacked reliable access. So, the landowning tribes were permitted to enjoy and profit from their property, but only if they required a tenth each of their surplus. Notice, joint responsibility here, right? Each one of them, to the extent that they excluded, was responsible for the loss. Right? You see what I'm saying, right? They were required to contribute a tenth of their surplus so that those who lacked land could nevertheless enjoy the access and resources they needed for life. Right? And to the extent that they refused, they shared some measure of the responsibility of the resultant deprivation, and that's why they had to pay restitution. Right? So the implication here is that the person who refuses to contribute is retaining a proportion of God's bounty that was never intended solely for themselves. The Torah teaches that God owns the earth. God grants all people the right to take from the earth the resources necessary to satisfy their basic needs. God also grants individuals right to own things, including the gift to acquire property, to control, etc. But property ownership necessarily excludes others from the use of the resources that you own. Right? For that reason, our right to own property is legitimate only when it is exercised in a manner that does not contribute unjustly to the deprivation of others. If we profit from exclusion or ignoring the needs of those, if we profit from having property which we can exclude others from, while ignoring the needs of others, we are misusing the property God gave us, and to that extent, He considers us to be misappropriating His funds. We are withholding a proportion that we neither created nor earned, a proportion that belongs to Him, and He's reserved for the good of others. And I think that's a really challenging thing to think about. And I think we look at the tithe, people often miss what I think is a really important message that's involved in it. Thank you.